Hi, this is Matt Dean with A Plus College Ready, and we're going to talk a little bit today about evolution. First of all, a little bit about the history of the theory of evolution. We'll start with Carolus Linnaeus. Carolus Linnaeus was the father of taxonomy. That's the science of classification. In his original system, he organized all of life into two kingdoms, the plant kingdom, or plantae, and animalia. He used a system called binomial nomenclature. This means that each organism was assigned a two-part name. In binomial nomenclature, the genus name is written first and has a capitalized first letter. The species name is written second and is not capitalized. The whole name is written in Latin, and it's either italicized if it's typed or underlined if it's written out. The current levels or taxa in the classification system include the largest, most inclusive domain, the domain. Domains are composed of similar, evolutionarily related kingdoms. Kingdoms, on the other hand, are composed from similar, evolutionarily related phyla, or in plants, we call those divisions. So we can see there are three domains. There are bacteria, there are archaea, both composed of prokaryotic cells, and then there are eukarya. Eukarya, that includes animals, plants, fungi, and protists. So here are the kingdoms. Depending on the classification system that you look at, you may hear about 5, you may hear 6 kingdoms. The one that's sort of debatable is Protista, because this one includes both the animal-like protists like euglenas and amoebas. It also includes the plant-like protists like algae. So a phylum or a division, these are composed of similar evolutionary related classes. And then next comes class, then order, family, genus, and finally species. Species is the least inclusive, most specific taxon. So species, again, is the least inclusive of all categories. It's the most specific taxon. Organisms in the same species are very closely related. They can interbreed, and their offspring are fertile. An easy way to remember the order of the taxa is using an acronym. There are lots of different ones. One of the most popular ones right now is this one. Dominating King Philip came over for green salad. So again, that's domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. So Linnaeus originally based his taxonomic system on morphology, like body shape and structure. But the modern classification system is based on evolutionary relationships. Organisms in the same taxa are put there because they're thought to be evolutionarily related and share common ancestors. So here we can see sort of how the system works. Now, domain would be up here. So we're looking at humans. So humans would be in the domain eukarya. That would be the same domain as plants, protists, fungi, and all other animals. But we're in the kingdom animalia. So that eliminates plants, fungi, protists. We're in the phylum Chordata. This is essentially the vertebrate animals. So all the invertebrates are eliminated at this point. We're in the class Mammalia. So this includes only animals with that are vertebrates, that feed their young with milk, have body hair, are warm-blooded. We're in the order Primates. So these are essentially mammals that have 3D vision and an opposable thumb. Essentially, we're talking about the monkeys here and the humans and the monkey relatives like the apes. Then we get to the family, Hominidae. These are primates that can walk upright. We get to the genus Homo. So these include modern men and some of what we might call cavemen, like Homo habilis and so on. And then finally, we get down to Homo sapiens, which is our specific species for modern human beings. And we are the only organisms in that species. As you can see, we start at the most inclusive category, which is actually domain. And then as we go down, the number of organisms in each taxa get less and less because the organisms in those groups are becoming more and more related. Next, we'll talk a minute about Charles Lyell. Lyell became one of Darwin's best friends. He wrote a book called The Principles of Geology. He came up with this idea of uniformitarianism. And essentially, he said that the same geologic processes that were happening in the present have been happening over all of time, and that these processes are constantly changing the Earth. Things like the Grand Canyon was formed by erosion over many, 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 many years. So his ideas were sort of incorporated into Darwin's, and they supported his idea, and essentially they led a lot of support to the fact that the Earth had to be a lot older than people at the time thought it was. Then we get to Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. So Lamarck proposed a theory of evolution through the inheritance of acquired traits. He proposed his theory in 1809. Darwin was just born. A lot of times the giraffe is used as an example for his theory. The main ideas with this theory are these. Number one, living organisms or their component parts tend to increase in size. Production of a new organ occurs when there's a need for a new organ. Continued use of an organ makes it get more developed, while disuse of an organ results in its degeneration. And acquired characteristics or modifications developed by individuals during their own lifetime are inheritable, and they accumulate over a period of time, and these can result in a new species. The problems with the theory are essentially that Lamarck didn't know anything about genetics. Lamarck was before Mendel. He didn't understand genetics. Acquired traits cannot be inherited. They can't be passed on. Just because you work out a lot and get big muscles during your life, that doesn't mean your children are going to be born with big muscles. Genetic traits are passed to the next generation. Acquired traits are not. It's also true that living organisms don't necessarily tend to increase in size. New organs aren't just produced when there's a need for one, and organs that aren't used don't necessarily just degenerate. So there's a lot of problems with Lamarck's theory. Now we'll get to the more accepted current theory, evolution via natural selection. This was proposed by Charles Darwin and also Alfred Wallace in about 1859. Like I said before, it's the current accepted theory of evolution. It's compatible with an understanding of genetics. According to Darwin, natural selection is the mechanism of evolution. Natural selection is the process in which organisms that are best adapted to their environment tend to survive and transmit their genetic characteristics in increasing numbers to succeeding generations, while those that are less adapted either are eliminated or don't reproduce as much, and therefore their genes aren't passed on as often as those that are better adapted to an environment. Evolution, in its most simple form, is about reproduction. Organisms that are better adapted to an environment out-reproduce those that are poorly adapted to that environment. Darwin essentially came up with 4 factors that need to be in place for evolution through natural selection to occur. First of all, there has to be genetic variability in the population. That variation can come through sexual reproduction, things like random fertilization of sperm and egg, crossing over during meiosis, independent assortment during meiosis. It can come from mutations. It can come from immigration. But there has to be variation within the population. Second one, more offspring are produced than can survive. Nature selects certain organisms to die. Certain organisms die because of limited resources, predation, etc. 3, some organisms are better adapted than others, and these adaptations have to be genetic. The organisms that are better adapted are more likely to survive, but according to number 4, the most important thing is that they're more likely to reproduce. And because they have more offspring than their competitors that aren't as well adapted, they become more and more common, and the genes of their competitors become less and less common in the population. Evolution is often referred to as the survival of the fittest. Fitness does not necessarily mean the strongest or the biggest or the baddest. In a biological context, fitness means the ability to survive to reproductive age, get a mate, and produce offspring. It's about reproduction. Organisms that are the most fit have the most babies and therefore pass on the most genes. You might also hear the word fecundity used to refer to the reproductive rate. So here's sort of a comparison between Lamarck's idea and Darwin's idea. So Lamarck's idea was that the ancestors of giraffes had little short necks, and that as time went on, competition happened. There wasn't as much food for them to be able to reach, so they started stretching their necks. And somehow, as they stretched, their neck actually became longer. And over generations, it became longer and longer and longer. And their babies were born with longer and longer necks. Now, again, that sounds ridiculous because we know none of that's genetic. This is about acquired traits. And we know those can't be passed on. Darwin's idea was that there was some variation in the population. There were some short-necked giraffe ancestors, but there were some with longer necks and some with even longer necks. And that because of the limited resources, the lack of food, those with longer necks could reach higher, get more leaves, they had full bellies, therefore they were more healthy, they had more babies, and that over time, the genes for longer necks became more and more common than the genes for shorter necks. And that's why the giraffes surviving today have longer necks. That's natural selection. That's Darwin's idea of evolution. So there's some important terms associated with evolution that you need to be familiar with. First of all, you've got to know this definition of evolution. Evolution in its most simple form is a change in the allele frequency of a population over time. Now remember, an allele is a form of a gene. So we're essentially just looking at how common are certain versions of a gene compared to others in a population over time. It's important to remember that the population, the group of the same species in the same place at the same time, the population evolves. Individuals cannot evolve. That's a huge point to know. There's also what we call microevolution. So microevolution is when evolution happens within a population, usually happens over a short time, and it causes small changes within the population, but not enough to lead to speciation or the formation of a new species. Macroevolution, on the other hand, is a major evolutionary change within the population that splits it into different species. So sometimes we'll use the word species essentially synonymously with macroevolution. We already talked about natural selection, Darwin's mechanism of evolution. Here's a more formal definition: the process whereby organisms better adapted to their environment tend to survive and produce more offspring. And again, Darwin called that, or people call it today, Darwin's mechanism of evolution. It's how it happens. Another important term to know about is artificial selection, or what's also sometimes called selective breeding. So this is when humans actively choose which traits are passed on to offspring. This could be in crop plants, or it could be in certain kinds of animals that we breed. Even before we knew about genetics, farmers had been choosing which cattle got to breed, which plants bred with which other plants. So they were picking beneficial traits. They knew they could be inherited. And over time, essentially, they caused human-caused evolution. That's artificial selection. So there have been lots of situations in which artificial selection has backfired or caused some negative outcomes. One of those is with insecticides. So as we've used more and more insecticides, insects with genes for resistance or tolerance to the insecticide, those have been the ones that have lived and the ones that have reproduced. So the insects become more and more resistant, more and more tolerant of the insecticide across generations. The same thing has happened with antibiotics. When you use antibiotics, you kill off first the bacteria that have no resistance or very little resistance. And the ones that might get left behind and passed on and able to reproduce, at least, those are the ones that are somewhat resistant. And as we use more and more antibiotics for longer and longer periods of time, resistant bacteria have been selected for, and non-resistant bacteria have essentially been killed off. So our antibiotics become less and less effective across time because of this. That's also true for antiviral drugs like those used to treat HIV. The HIV virus has become more and more resistant to those drugs.